At 24 years old, Nora Hayes believed the will had left her exactly what life had always left her. The unwanted part, her adoptive grandmother, was gone. Her older brother, Grant, inherited the waterfront house, the investment accounts, the boat shares, and enough money to make the rest of his life smooth. Nora received a rusted brass key tied to a string, a storm-battered keeper's cottage on an island most people had forgotten, and a lighthouse the county had already marked as unsafe. Grant laughed when the lawyer read it aloud, but Evelyn Hayes had not left Nora a ruin. She had left her a door, and behind that door was a secret generations of women had guarded from storms, developers, and time itself. By the end of it, Nora would learn that the greatest inheritance is not always the one that makes you rich. Sometimes, it is the one that finally proves you were worth choosing. The funeral took place on a cold April morning beside the harbor in a small town on the Maine coast. Fog rolled in low over the water, wrapping the docks in gray. Fishing boats rocked softly against their ropes. Gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp enough to cut through the minister's prayer. Nora stood near the back of the crowd in a black coat that had lost 2 buttons and never quite fit her shoulders. She kept both hands in her pockets because if she took them out, people would see them shaking. Evelyn Hayes had not been her blood. That had mattered to some people. It had never mattered to Evelyn. Before Evelyn, Nora had belonged to county paperwork, temporary beds, supervised visits, and the quiet humiliation of being introduced as a placement. She had lived in 3 foster homes by the age of 9, and had learned early not to unpack too much. A toothbrush, a sweater, a book, if she could keep it. Anything more was dangerous, because anything more could be left behind. When Nora was 11, she met Evelyn at a library reading program for children in care. Evelyn was already in her 60s, then silver-haired, stubborn, with sea-blue eyes and hands that smelled faintly of lemon soap and wood smoke. She was not there to rescue anyone. She told Nora that the very first day. "I don't believe in rescuing," Evelyn had said, sliding a worn copy of The Secret Garden across the table. "I believe in staying." Nora did not understand what that meant. Not then, but Evelyn came back the next Saturday. Then the next, then she invited Nora to help shelve books. Then she brought soup in a thermos during winter. Then she sat beside Nora in court while the judge asked questions no child should have to answer. 6 months later, Evelyn brought her home. Grant had already been there. He was Evelyn's first adopted child, 8 years older than Nora. Charming in the effortless way some people are when the world has always opened quickly for them. He had good grades, clean shoes, a scholarship waiting, and a smile adults trusted before he even spoke. Nora had watched him from across dinner tables, trying to imitate the way he belonged. She never quite managed it. Now Grant stood in the front row beside Evelyn's coffin, accepting condolences as if he had practiced the role. People touched his shoulder. They told him his grandmother would have been proud. They asked about his real estate firm in Portland and the new marina project he was backing. Nora heard all of it from a few feet away, invisible in the fog. When the service ended, the mourners drifted toward the road. Grant was surrounded within seconds. Nora remained by the grave a little longer, staring at the white roses on the casket, and feeling something old open in her chest. It was the same feeling she used to have when a foster mother packed her clothes into a garbage bag. The feeling of being sent away again, only this time. There was nowhere else to go. 3 days later, Nora sat in a law office above a bait shop, listening to rain tap against the window glass. Mr. Calder, Evelyn's attorney, was nearly 80, and moved as if every bone had its own weather. His office smelled of salt old paper and coffee burned too many times. A ship's clock ticked on the wall, Behind him, framed photographs showed the harbor in seasons Nora barely remembered. Grant sat beside her in a tailored gray suit, scrolling through messages on his phone. He looked rested. Nora had not slept for more than 2 hours at a time since the funeral. Mr. Calder opened Evelyn's will. At first, nothing surprised anyone. Donations to the public library, a small fund for the animal shelter, her quilts to 2 church friends, her cookbooks to the women who had traded recipes with her for decades. Then the lawyer cleared his throat. To my grandson, Grant Hayes, I leave my residence on Harbor Lane, all furnishings not otherwise designated, my brokerage accounts, my share in Hayes Marine Holdings, and the remaining liquid assets of my estate. Grant did not smile too broadly. He was too polished for that, but Nora saw the satisfaction settle across his face. He had expected this. Everyone had. The waterfront house alone was worth more than Nora could imagine. The accounts, the company shares, the boats, the land beneath the old storage buildings near the marina. Together, it was a life raft built out of money. Mr. Calder turned the page. To my granddaughter, Nora Hayes, I leave North Lantern Station on Little Harker Island, including the keeper's cottage, Lighthouse Tower, outbuildings, shoreline access, and all contents contained therein. The ticking clock suddenly sounded much louder. Grant looked up. Then he laughed. Not a small laugh, not an accidental one. A real laugh that bounced off the old office walls. "You cannot be serious," he said. Mr. Calder did not blink. "I am reading the document exactly as Evelyn wrote it. North Lantern." Grant leaned back, amused. "That place is practically falling into the Atlantic." Nora stared at the desk. She had heard Evelyn mention Little Harker Island only a handful of times. A closed lighthouse. A keeper's cottage. A place from before Nora was born. Evelyn had always changed the subject quickly, and Nora had never pushed. Grant shook his head. "The county fenced that tower off years ago." "It is not fenced now," Mr. Calder said. Grant turned to Nora with a half-smile. "Well, congratulations. You own a lawsuit with windows." Nora said nothing. Mr. Calder reached into a drawer and removed a small canvas pouch. He placed it carefully in front of her. Inside was a packet of papers, a folded nautical chart, and an old brass key so dark with age it looked almost black. A strip of faded blue ribbon had been tied through the ring. Nora touched it with one finger. For reasons she could not explain. The key felt warm. Grant stood and buttoned his jacket. Good luck finding someone to insure it. Mr. Calder's jaw tightened. "Your grandmother made separate instructions regarding that key." Grant paused. The old lawyer looked at Nora. "She said it was to be given directly to you. Not mailed, not copied, not placed with the rest of the estate." Nora swallowed. "Why?" Mr. Calder's expression softened, but his answer was strange. "Because she said you would know what to listen for." Grant rolled his eyes. "Of course she did. Evelyn always did love a mystery." He left before the rain stopped. Nora stayed in the chair, staring at the key in her palm, wondering how something so small could feel heavier than all the money Grant had just inherited. That evening, she returned to her apartment over a closed laundromat on the edge of town. The hallway smelled of damp carpet. The radiator clanged. Someone had taped a notice to the wall about unpaid utilities. Under her door was an envelope from the bookstore CAF where she worked. Nora knew before she opened it. The CAF had been struggling for months. Reduced hours, reduced staff, reduced hope. Her position had been eliminated. She sat on the kitchen floor with the letter in one hand and Evelyn's key in the other. Outside, Rain streaked the window inside. The refrigerator made a tired humming sound, as if even the appliances were exhausted. By midnight, she had cried herself empty. Then she opened the canvas pouch again. The nautical chart unfolded across the floor. Little Harker Island was a dark shape printed among shoals and tide marks, less than 2 miles off the coast, but far enough to feel like another world. North Lantern Station sat at the island's highest point, marked with a tiny black tower. A photograph slipped from the chart. Nora picked it up. It showed a little girl in a red raincoat standing on stone steps beside a lighthouse. Her hair was windblown across her face. One hand clutched Evelyn's, the other held a paper cup of cocoa. Nora remembered the coat before she remembered the place. She had worn it the first spring after Evelyn brought her home. On the back of the photograph, in Evelyn's careful handwriting, were 8 words: "When the fog comes, follow the bell." Nora stared at the sentence until the ink blurred. The next morning, she packed what she owned into 2 duffel bags and took the ferry toward Little Harker Island. The boat crossed under a low ceiling of clouds. Wind slapped cold spray against the windows. Nora sat alone on a wooden bench, the key wrapped in her fist, while the mainland shrank behind her. Little Harker was smaller than she expected. There were no shops, no paved roads, no cars. Just a gravel landing, a few seasonal cottages shuttered until summer, and a path climbing through spruce trees toward the ridge. The air smelled of wet stone, pine pitch, and ocean salt. By the time Nora reached the top, her arms ached from carrying her bags. Then she saw it. North Lantern Station. The lighthouse rose from the cliff, like a bone the sea had refused to swallow. Its white paint had peeled in long strips. The lantern glass was clouded with salt. The iron railing near the top had rusted reddish-brown, and warning signs leaned crooked in the grass. Beside it stood the keeper's cottage, gray-shingled and tired, with a sagging porch and windows, filmed by years of weather. Grant had not been wrong. It looked like a place people had given up on. Nora stood in the wind, suddenly aware of how alone she was. A gull screamed overhead. The sound made her flinch. For a moment she almost turned back toward the path. She could still return to the mainland. She could sell the property for whatever it was worth. She could call Grant and let him make one of his clever deals. Then she remembered Evelyn's voice. "I believe in staying." Nora climbed the porch steps. The boards groaned but held. The brass key resisted in the lock, then turned with a deep metallic click that seemed to travel through the whole cottage. Inside, the air was cold and dry. Dust lay over everything. Sheets covered furniture. A braided rug had faded almost white. On the mantel sat a row of smooth stones, each one labeled in Evelyn's handwriting with dates Nora did not recognize. The cottage was not abandoned. It was waiting. Nora moved from room to room. There was a narrow kitchen with a hand pump beside the sink, a bedroom with an iron bed, shelves of old tins and jars, a parlor with a cracked mirror, and a small writing desk facing the sea. That first night, she slept under 2 wool blankets, while wind pressed against the windows and the lighthouse tower moaned softly beside the cottage. It was not a frightening sound. It sounded like a tired giant breathing in its sleep. Over the next 2 days, Nora cleaned because cleaning was easier than thinking. She swept sand from the floorboards, opened windows, shook dust from curtains, and carried broken chairs into the shed. She found hurricane lamps, canned peaches older than seemed wise, a stack of Evelyn's old sweaters, and a box of children's books wrapped carefully in oilcloth. On the 3rd afternoon, fog moved in. It came suddenly, swallowing the sea first, then the rocks, then the path to the landing. Within minutes, the world beyond the windows disappeared. The cottage seemed to float inside a pale gray silence. Nora was searching a cabinet for matches When she heard it, one soft ring, then another, a bell. The sound came from outside, but not from the shore. It was closer than that. Hollow metal, slow. Nora grabbed a lamp and stepped onto the porch. The fog was thick enough to bead on her eyelashes. She followed the sound around the cottage and toward the base of the lighthouse tower. There, half hidden by beach grass, stood an iron fog bell suspended in a rusted frame. It should not have been moving. There was no rope attached, no visible hammer, just the wind, the fog, and that low, aching ring. Then Nora saw what the bell's motion had shaken loose. A narrow strip of wood near the tower door had cracked open. Behind it was a keyhole, not the cottage keyhole. Smaller, older. Her pulse quickened. She pulled Evelyn's brass key from her pocket and slid it in. The lock turned. A panel opened inside the base of the lighthouse, revealing a space beneath the first curve of the spiral stairs. Nora lifted the lamp higher. A second door waited there, painted the same color as the stone so perfectly that no one would ever notice it unless they were looking directly at it. On the door was a brass plate, green with age. The keeper's room. Nora's mouth went dry. She pushed it open. The room behind it was larger than it should have been, tucked into the thick foundation of the lighthouse. Shelves lined the curved walls from floor to ceiling. Sea chests stood beneath them. Maps hung rolled in canvas tubes. Glass jars held buttons, coins, scraps of ribbon, and tiny folded notes. There were journals, logbooks, photograph albums, letters bundled with twine, and ledgers filled with names. In the center of the room stood a table with a single oil lamp waiting on it. Beside the lamp lay an envelope for Nora. She recognized Evelyn's handwriting instantly. Her knees weakened. She sat slowly, afraid that if she moved too quickly, the room might vanish. The letter inside was short. My dearest Nora, if you found this room, then the bell still knows how to call the right person. You were never given the small inheritance. You were given the guarded one. This station was kept by women our town learned to depend on, and then forgot. Some were Hayes women. Some were not. Some were wives, daughters, widows, teachers, nurses, cooks, foster mothers, and girls with nowhere else to go. They kept the light. They kept the records. They kept each other. I protected this place because it was never meant for the person who wanted the most. It was meant for the person who would listen. That was always you. Nora pressed the letter against her chest and cried so hard the lamp flame trembled. For 3 weeks, Nora lived between the cottage and the keeper's room. Each morning she made coffee on the old stove and watched the tide pull silver lines across the rocks below. Each afternoon, she went into the hidden room and read until her eyes burned. Each night, she fell asleep with salt in her hair, and Evelyn's letter beside her bed. The records were not treasure in the way Grant would have understood the word. There were no gold bars, no stock certificates, no forgotten bank account. There were stories, hundreds of them. There was Agnes Hayes, who kept the lamp burning through the blizzard of 1888 while her husband lay feverish in the cottage. There was Miriam Cole, a widow who rowed 3 fishermen through breaking ice after their dory smashed against the reef. There was Lottie Bell, who taught island children to read from shipping catalogs during the Depression. There was Ruthie Pike, a 14-year-old runaway who arrived at the station in 1944 and stayed to help with blackout watch along the coast. Nora read rescue logs written in shaking hands, recipes copied during ration years, birth records, death notices, letters from sailors who had seen the light and made it home, lists of children fed from the cottage kitchen when their parents were lost at sea, or lost to drink, or simply gone. The more Nora read, the less the room felt like a room. It felt like a chorus. Women who had been overlooked in life had left proof that they had mattered. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. Like a light turning through fog one evening, Nora found a blue ledger wrapped in linen and sealed with a ribbon. Inside were names and dates going back almost a century. At first, she thought it was a guest book. Then she realized every entry belonged to a child. Children taken in after storms. Children placed temporarily by churches. Children whose parents worked the boats and could not feed them through winter. Children with no last names. Children who left with new coats, new shoes, or simply a place to sleep until morning. Nora's breath caught on one entry near the end. November 3rd. Nora May, age 11. Stayed 3 nights. Loved cocoa. Would not sleep unless the hallway light remained on. Tried to hide a library book under her coat because she thought she was not allowed to keep it. Nora covered her mouth. She had been here. Not once. Not only for the photograph. Evelyn had brought her to Little Harker before the adoption was final, when Nora was still too frightened to trust any promise. Nora had forgotten most of it, or buried it, or turned it into fragments too soft to hold. But the room remembered. In the back of the ledger, Evelyn had written one final note. Some children arrive believing they are a burden. If we are careful, they leave knowing they are a light. Nora closed the book and sat in the quiet, shaking. For years, she had believed love was something other people received more naturally than she did. Grant had seemed born into it. Evelyn had given it to Nora. Yes, but some deep part of Nora had always feared it was charity, a kindness, a duty. Now she understood. Evelyn had not handed her pity. She had handed her the watch. The feeling was powerful. It was also terrifying. Because the cottage roof leaked, the tower needed structural work. The property taxes were real. The ferry only came twice a week. Nora had no job, no savings, and no idea how to protect something this fragile from the world that had ignored it for so long. Grant called after a month. She almost did not answer. When she did, his voice was smooth and practical. He had spoken to someone at the county office. There was developer interest in Little Harker, summer rentals, private retreats, maybe a boutique event property if the tower could be stabilized. He knew people. He could help. Help me how? Nora asked. By getting you out before the place swallows you, Grant said. Nora, I'm not trying to be cruel. You can't afford that island. She looked around the keeper's room at the shelves of names. I'm not selling. A pause. You don't even know what you have. Nora almost laughed. No, she said quietly. I'm starting to. The next storm came hard. Rain struck the cottage roof sideways. Wind dragged at the shutters. Sometime after midnight, a section of ceiling in the back bedroom collapsed, sending plaster and old insulation across the floor. Nora stood in the hallway in her socks, staring at the damage while water dripped steadily into a saucepan. For the first time since arriving, doubt won. She sank onto the floor and thought of Grant's warm house, his clean car, his certainty. She thought of the bank account that would soon be empty. She thought of Evelyn asking too much from a girl who had spent most of her life trying simply not to be sent away. Then the fog bell rang once, not loud, not dramatic, just enough. Nora rose and went to the keeper's room. She did not know what she was looking for. Maybe comfort, maybe permission to quit. Instead, she found a metal box inside the bottom shelf of a sea chest. The box contained photographs, newspaper clippings, and a typed inventory dated 1976. Historical survey of North Lantern Station. The report described the keeper records as a rare continuous domestic and maritime archive documenting women's labor, emergency care, informal child welfare, and coastal survival practices from the late 19th century through the post-war period. Nora read the sentence 3 times. Rare continuous archive. Not clutter, not family junk, not old paper history. The next morning she used the last reliable signal on her phone to email a woman she had met years earlier at the town library. Dr. Celia Ward had been a maritime historian visiting for a public lecture. Evelyn had dragged Nora to it and made her ask a question afterward. Nora found the old email address buried in her contacts. She sent photographs of the room, the ledger, the 1976 report, and one line. I think my grandmother left me something I do not understand. Celia called before sunset. Her voice was breathless. Nora, do not move a single thing until I get there. 2 days later, Celia arrived on the ferry with 2 waterproof cases, a scanner, and the expression of someone trying very hard not to run uphill. When Nora opened the keeper's room door, Celia stopped speaking. For a long time, she simply stood there. Then she whispered, "Oh, Evelyn, what did you save?" For the next week, the Lighthouse station changed. Celia catalogued logs, photographed fragile pages, identified family names, checked storm dates, and grew more astonished each day. She confirmed what the report had suggested. North Lantern was not merely a family archive. It was a community archive, a record of coastal women's labor and informal care that had almost disappeared from the official history of the region. "This belongs in a museum," Celia said one evening. Nora's stomach tightened. Celia saw her face and gently corrected herself. "I mean it belongs with museum, level care, not necessarily away from here." Nora looked toward the tower where the old lens room caught the last orange light of evening. "They stayed here," she said. "Their stories should stay here too." Celia nodded slowly. "Then we build the care around them." That sentence became the beginning, not quickly. Nothing important happened quickly. First came paperwork, then emergency preservation grants, then structural inspections, volunteer cleanup weekends, archival boxes, humidity monitors, and a temporary roof repair, paid for by 3 local historical groups, and one anonymous donor Nora suspected was Mr. Calder. Nora learned words she had never expected to use: conservation, provenance, oral history protocol, non-profit filing, shoreline easement, interpretive plan. She also learned how many people appear when a story finally gives them a place to stand. Retired fishermen came with memories of parents and grandparents. Teachers brought student volunteers. A carpenter repaired the porch at cost because his aunt's name appeared in a 1932 food ledger. A former Coast Guard mechanic helped stabilize the fog bell. Dr. Celia Ward brought graduate students who treated the keeper's room as if it were sacred ground. Nora was embarrassed at first when visitors asked her questions. She had no degree, no title, no professional clothes suitable for donor meetings. She still owned only 2 decent sweaters and 1 pair of boots that did not leak. But whenever people wanted to understand the room, they turned to her, because Nora knew the names. She knew that Agnes wrote differently when she was frightened. She knew Miriam underlined weather changes before bad wrecks. She knew Lottie tucked poems between ration lists. She knew Evelyn had copied every child's name with the same care, whether the child stayed 1 night or 1 year. One afternoon, Celia asked Nora why she refused to send the archive to Portland. Nora ran her hand over the table in the keeper's room. "Because I spent my whole childhood being moved for other people's convenience," she said. "I don't want to do that to them." Celia did not answer immediately. Then she smiled. "That is the clearest mission statement I have ever heard." The idea for the children came from the ledger. Nora kept returning to those pages. The children fed at the station, sheltered, remembered, written down. Not as cases, not as problems, as names. She thought about the group homes where she had once lived. The kids who carried all their belongings in trash bags. The kids who stopped asking where they were going next, because asking made it hurt more. She wrote to Harbor House, a youth residence on the mainland where children in long-term care stayed when placements fell through. She expected paperwork, hesitation, maybe a polite. The director called the next day. "You want to bring our girls to a Lighthouse archive?" she asked. "Yes," Nora said, "and I want them to write their own stories there." There was a pause. Then the director said, "When can we come?" The first visit happened on a bright July afternoon. 8 girls stepped off the ferry in hoodies, borrowed jackets, and careful silence. Nora recognized the look immediately. It was not rudeness. It was armor, the guarded face of children who had learned not to be impressed too soon. She greeted each one by name. At the cottage, she showed them the kitchen first, because food made the place less formal. Then the porch, then the fog bell, then the tower base. When she opened the keeper's room, the girls went quiet in a different way. Not empty quiet, wonder quiet. They moved slowly through the room, looking at maps, photographs, journals, and shelves of boxes labeled by decade. One girl asked if all the people in the books were famous. Nora shook her head. Most of them were ordinary. The girl frowned. Then why save all this? Nora picked up the blue ledger and turned to a page where a child's name had been written in ink 80 years earlier. Because ordinary does not mean unimportant. Later, the girls gathered around the long table with pencils and notebooks. Nora read from Miriam Cole's rescue account, then from Evelyn's ledger, then from a letter written by a child who had stayed at the station during the winter of 1951. When she finished, no one spoke for several seconds. Then a girl named Tessa, 13, with bitten nails and a voice barely above a whisper, asked, "Would a story like mine be worth keeping?" The question struck Nora so deeply she had to breathe before answering. She saw herself at 11, hiding a library book under her coat because she believed anything she loved might be taken away. She saw Evelyn sliding the book back toward her and saying, "You can keep what helps you survive." Nora looked at Tessa. "Yes," she said. "Especially yours." Tessa blinked fast and looked down at her notebook. Around the table, other girls began writing. That was the day North Lantern Station became more than an archive. It became a promise. By autumn, the program had a name: the Lantern Room. Every month, children from Harbor House came to the island. They read old records. They learned how to preserve photographs. They wrote letters to their future selves and placed copies in a new archive box labeled Living Stories. They planted a small garden beside the cottage, because Evelyn's notes said the station always kept herbs for soup. Mint, thyme, chives, and lavender took root in the rocky soil. The lighthouse tower was not fully restored yet. The roof still leaked in places. Grants were slow. Repairs cost more than optimism. Nora learned that purpose did not make life easy. It made the difficulty worth meeting. One afternoon, a documentary crew from Boston arrived after Celia's article about North Lantern spread through historical societies and foster care networks. Nora almost refused. Cameras made her nervous. Attention made her want to disappear. Celia reminded her that the story was no longer only hers, so Nora agreed. The crew filmed the fog bell, the keeper's room, the ledgers, the girls writing at the table, the old lamp being cleaned by gloved hands. They filmed Nora standing beside the tower in a wool sweater, hair whipped by wind, explaining how a hidden archive had survived, because women who were rarely credited had kept each other visible. But the moment that changed everything happened off to the side. The producer interviewed Tessa. She had been coming to the island for 4 months by then. Her shoulders were less hunched. Her notebook was always full. She had started helping younger girls read the old handwriting. The producer asked, "What did this place teach you?" Tessa looked toward the keeper's room door. "It taught me that being forgotten is not the same as being worthless," she said. The room behind the camera went silent. Tessa continued, voice trembling but clear. "Those women were not rich. They were not important to the people writing history. But they saved lives. They fed kids. They kept the light on. Someone wrote their names down. So maybe if my name gets written down, I can become more than what happened to me." Nora had to turn away. Not because she was ashamed of crying, because she finally understood Evelyn's plan. The inheritance had never been the lighthouse. It had never been the property. It had never even been the archive. It was belief, placed carefully into Nora's hand. Long before she knew how to carry it, the documentary aired in December. By then, winter had wrapped little Harker in steel, gray water, and early darkness. Nora watched from the cottage with Celia, Mr. Calder, 3 volunteers, and 4 girls from Harbor House, who had begged to be there. When the segment ended, nobody spoke. Then Nora's phone rang. Grant. She stepped onto the porch to answer. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs. "Hello." For a moment, there was only static. Then Grant said, "I watched it." Nora looked toward the lighthouse tower. The old glass reflected a small slice of moon. "It was strange seeing the place on television," she said. "It was strange realizing I had been wrong about it." She said nothing. Grant exhaled. "I thought Evelyn gave me the real inheritance." Nora waited. "I think she gave me the easy one," he said, "and gave you the one that mattered." The words landed softly. Not because Nora needed them, but because she no longer did. A year earlier, she might have mistaken his approval for proof of her worth. Now she could hear it as something simpler. An apology beginning to form. "I'm proud of you," Grant said. Nora closed her eyes. For a long time, she had wanted to hear that from someone who stood above her in the family, but the ache it once would have filled was different now. Smaller, quieter. "Thank you," she said. When the call ended, she stayed on the porch. The fog bell moved slightly in the wind but did not ring. Down near the cottage windows, warm light spilled onto the grass. Inside, the girls were laughing, arguing gently over who got the last mug of cocoa. Nora thought of Evelyn. She thought of the day they met in the library when Evelyn said she believed in staying. Nora had thought staying meant not leaving someone behind. Now she knew it meant more. Staying meant guarding what others dismiss. Staying meant writing down the names the world forgets. Staying meant becoming the person who keeps a light burning, even when no one has promised to come. That night, after everyone went to bed, Nora walked into the keeper's room alone. The shelves stood steady in lamplight. The ledgers rested in archival boxes. The new Living Stories shelf held the first notebooks from Harbor House, each one labeled with permission and care. Past and present sat together, no longer hidden. At the center of the room hung the photograph Evelyn had left in the canvas pouch, a little girl in a red raincoat, a lighthouse behind her, a woman holding her hand. Nora touched the frame and whispered, "I found the bell." The room gave no answer, but she felt one anyway, not in words. In peace, North Lantern Station had been given to the girl everyone assumed received less. The broken tower, the leaking roof, the rusted key, the island too inconvenient to want, but what looked like less had opened into more than money could ever hold. A house can shelter a body. Money can soften a life, but belief can rebuild a person from the inside. Evelyn had known that. She had seen a frightened child who thought she was temporary and trusted her with something permanent. And now Nora understood the lesson the lighthouse had been teaching all along. A light does not calm the sea. It does not stop the storm. It simply stands where it is needed, turning again and again through the dark, telling anyone lost in the fog that they have not been forgotten. For the first time in her life, Nora Hayes did not wonder whether she belonged. She kept the light, and the light kept her.